Okay, I'm going to do the official introduction. I'm Hal Varian. I'm the chief economist here. I think many of you know me. Glen Weyl is a principal researcher at Microsoft, a principal researcher at Microsoft Research New England. And this year he's visiting Yale University as a senior research scholar and lecturer in the economics department and the law school, where he teaches a joint economics computer science course called Designing the Digital Economy. Glen is a townie. He grew up in Palo Alto, received his AB in economics at Princeton, followed by an MA and a PhD in 2008. He then spent 3 years as a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows and 3 years as an assistant professor at the University of Chicago before joining Microsoft. And over the period from 2014 to 2018, he's been a Sloan Research Fellow. And today, he's here to tell us about his book, Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society. Take it away.
Thanks, Hal. And thanks to everyone for coming. So this work is the culmination of many years of sort of careful policy design research with Eric Posner. But in the 10 minutes I have to introduce it, I think rather than going into the details of all of the proposals that we have, it's best to just give you a flavor of the sort of broad idea that we're trying to get across. And I think that that's best conveyed by a thought experiment. So I want you to, for the moment, suspend your practical considerations and come with me on a journey of imagination to a fictive city that I'm going to call Marketopia. So Marketopia is a bit like Zootopia, except rather than being defined by having a diverse group of mammals that inhabit it, instead, Marketopia is defined by the fact that all the major private property in Marketopia, let's put aside personal effects like heirlooms and pets and so forth, but all the land and the houses and the airplanes and so forth is continually up for auction to the highest bidder in a manner somewhat similar to the way that search terms are for Google advertisements. So basically, whoever is currently the highest bidder on one of these pieces of private property controls it for the time being by making a rental payment continually into a central pot until someone else comes along and beats their price and takes over that rental payment for control of that asset. And that's not just true of private property in Marketopia. In fact, many things that we would usually consider to be determined by collective decision-making processes, like the location of parks and the politicians that govern Marketopia, what sort of schools they have and what they teach and so forth. These are also determined by an auction process, though rather than auctioning them to the highest bidder, we add up the total willingness of everyone to pay for different alternatives, and we implement the one that people are willing in total to pay the most for. And all the money that's raised by these auctions is continually returned to all the citizens of Marketopia in equal shares as a social dividend, or you might call it a universal basic income, much as in Norway and Alaska, when they auction off oil rights, they return the revenue that they raise to the citizens. Now, when you hear this idea of Marketopia, it might sound like sort of the most extreme version of a free market that you can imagine. It's sort of like much crazier than anything that, say, Adam Smith could have imagined, because it makes you realize that even though we live in a market society, most things are not available for liquid purchase at any given point in time. Most of the land on the Google campus, most of the stock of Google, in fact, not just the marginal units of stock that are currently on bid, but most of the stock that all of you hold, these aren't things you could just go out and buy at some price at any point in time. Those are instead controlled by often wealthy, concentrated interests. And if you wanted to grab control of those assets, you'd have to enter into a long and drawn-out process of bargaining and probably pay many times what the person would be willing to accept, because they'd get wind that you'd want to buy that thing, right? And so Marketopia is a far more extreme, complete free market than any society in history. And that might lead you to think, okay, so in Marketopia, the wealthy are going to dominate everything, right? The wealthy are going to be able to outbid the prices that anyone else is going to pay. They're going to take control of assets, and they're going to use that to dominate everyone else in society. But then you have to ask yourself, what do you mean by the wealthy? Well, a wealthy person is someone who has lots of assets, like stocks and bonds and houses and land and businesses, right? But in Marketopia, there is no private ownership of those things. All of those things are continually auctioned for the public benefit. In fact, Marketopia is actually sort of the most extreme version of the sort of common ownership advocated by people like Karl Marx that you can imagine, much more extreme than forms of socialism that actually existed, which ended up in the control of those assets by a concentrated bureaucratic elite that often ended up tyrannizing over the rest of the population even more intensely than the capitalists that they claimed to replace. In Marketopia, on the other hand, there is true common ownership, because by construction, all the value of all assets flow equally to all citizens. And by construction, every citizen has an equal right to compete for control of assets. So this might seem like a paradox, especially to those of us who grew up in the Cold War and post-Cold War periods. How can like the most extreme form of common ownership, a sort of communism, go along with the most extreme form of a free market? Well, while that might seem like a paradox, it's actually a crucial part of what was the central tradition in a field called political economy that gave birth to economics, political science, sociology, and many other fields during the late 19th century. And this idea called competitive common ownership was especially associated with the work of this guy here. And I wonder if anyone recognizes him. Who is it?
That's Henry George.
Wow! This is the first time anyone has actually managed to identify him.
I do a radio show about this.
Well, I'm glad I came to the right place. So you could probably repeat the following things for me, but Henry George was the best-selling author in the English language, other than the Bible, for about 30 years. His book, Progress and Poverty, was the namesake of the progressive movement in the United States. He helped inspire the Chinese nationalist revolution and many other things. So he's an enormously influential person. And yet, his ideas are largely forgotten in the post-Cold War era. And the goal of this book is to revive the tradition that was represented by Henry George and others like Léon Walras, many of the founders of modern economics, who believed that true free markets and true socialism went hand in hand. And to argue that while these ideas were forgotten in mainstream culture, they continued to be developed in a field called mechanism design, which won lots of Nobel Prizes, but was largely applied to things like auctioning off search words at companies like Google and Facebook, rather than to the big problems of social organization, and to show that we can, based on this tradition, have a new way of organizing society to address our most pressing problems. And the way that we do that is by developing 5 detailed practical policy proposals building off of this spirit that instantiate this idea and address, we think, some of the most pressing problems of inequality, slow growth, and social conflict over political issues. So what are those ideas? The first, which is most closely associated with this auction I was describing, is the common ownership self-assessed tax, in which every owner of significant private property would self-assess the value of that property at some value, stand willing to sell the property at that value and then pay a tax on that self-assessed value. So this would be a way of implementing the auction that I was describing without taking all ownership into the public, so that people would still have some incentive to make investments. What on earth do I turn off this? So people would still have an incentive to make investments, and at the same time, all assets would be liquidly available for turnover to a better potential use. The second idea is quadratic voting. This is a system of sort of auctioning, but for collective decision making, that would protect minorities by allowing them to express the greater strength of their interest in given issues compared to majorities. The way that it would work is that every citizen would be endowed with a budget of voice credits that they could spend on different politicians or issues in a referenda that are important to them. And they could put more votes on the issues that were more important to them, but according to a very particular rule, which is that the cost in voice credits of influence on any given issue would be the square of the number of votes that you buy on that issue. Third, we propose a new system of migration in which immigration would benefit rather than just the immigrants and the capitalists in the wealthy countries. Instead, it would benefit all citizens, because rather than large corporations or governments determining who was admitted to the country, instead individual citizens would have the right to sponsor visas for migrants and to negotiate, subject to some protections, a share of the benefits that the migrants received from migrating to wealthy countries. So that would allow for massively increased migration, but with the broad support of the working classes of wealthy countries. Fourth, we argue that antitrust policy is an incredibly powerful tool for maintaining a competitive and dynamic economy, but that it has been almost completely unenforced in the two most important areas in which market power is accumulating in our economy, and therefore we've been ignoring about 80% of the, or maybe even 90% of the potential benefits of antitrust. Those two areas are that, first of all, institutional investors like Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock, et cetera, now control about 1/3 of the total corporate economy and are the 4 or 5 largest shareholders of almost every major corporation, straight across industries. Google and Microsoft, American Airlines and Delta. And therefore, they have no interest in seeing these companies compete with each other. And we've seen rising prices in close correlation to the growing power of these companies. So that's sort of the most comprehensive market power that's ever existed, because it's coordinated almost the entirety of the corporate economy. Another area that's been almost completely neglected by antitrust policy has been the power that companies have over workers rather than over consumers. Because if you think about a typical consumption decision you make, like what type of water to drink, there's probably 10 or 15 reasonable alternatives you have. Whereas if you think about job, what's your next best job rather than working at Google? It's probably a way worse option, and maybe you have one other option, but it's much less competitive than is a typical product market. And yet there's literally never been an antitrust merger case that blocked a merger because of the way it reduced options for employment for workers. And finally, we argue that the individual contributions that people make to the digital economy should be treated as essentially labor, and that there should be a labor movement of people who are contributing that data to organize to demand a fair share of the value created by their data from companies like Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, because increasingly people are worried about artificial intelligence taking people's jobs. But as all of us here know, all that artificial intelligence is trained based on human data. And it's in fact a lot more like some sort of broadcasting of our data than it is just brilliant engineers programming computers to go and take people's jobs. And so if people were more fairly compensated for their data, the digital economy would be a source of economic opportunity for people rather than an economic threat. Now, all these ideas are quite radical. All of them would require fundamental changes to our social institutions. And while for each of these chapters we have concrete, near-term, non-controversial steps we can make in that direction, we also know that as a broad social philosophy, no one would seriously consider this if we weren't in a moment of social crisis that really deeply required new out-of-the-box thinking like this to avoid potentially catastrophic outcomes. But I truly do believe we are in a moment like that for three reasons. One is growing inequality. So on the left here, we see a graph of the share of national income accruing to the top 1% and top 0.1% of the income distribution, which has doubled since the 1970s. And at the same time, we've seen a dramatic reduction in the share of income accruing not just to lower income workers, but to all workers in total. So the share of income being paid out to labor as opposed to capital has fallen by 10% over this period. Now, you might think, as say Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher would have argued, that, well, that might be worth it if that's the price of a more dynamic, more competitive, more innovative economy. But at the same time that we've seen this declining share going to labor, we've seen an increasing power of corporations to exert monopoly power. So that is represented by this orange line here. I've taken the markup that firms charge, that is how much above their marginal cost they charge, and I've flipped it around so you can see how closely it parallels the decline in labor incomes. So that strongly suggests that far from us getting a more competitive economy by deregulating, cutting taxes, and relaxing antitrust policy, we've actually seen an increasing growth of market power that is actually reducing growth rates in the economy, as represented in this graph here. So what this shows is growth rates in different wealthy countries in the immediate post-war period and then various periods thereafter. And the period of the last several decades has had growth rates that are in the United States about half, and in many other wealthy countries about a tenth of what they were in the immediate post-war period. So this combination of stagnation with growing inequality, I think, has largely discredited existing economic ideologies as coming out of Reagan and Thatcher, in the same way that the combination of stagnation and inflation during the 1970s discredited the previous Keynesian orthodoxy. And this stagnant quality, as we label it, and the discrediting of existing economic ideologies has also led to rising political discontent and conflict, together with the fact that I think political institutions, not just economic technocracy, but political technocracy, is increasingly being viewed as illegitimate. There's growing conflicts between minorities and majorities, whether over immigration, ethno-racial conflict, or over, say, things like gun ownership, religious minorities. And yet, the way that wealthy countries have increasingly resolved these issues has been through the judiciary or through supranational institutions, in the case of the European Union, that lack the democratic legitimacy needed for countries to come to some reasonable way of resolving this. So there's an increasing feeling that the economic policies and the way that we resolve political disputes are illegitimate. And that's leading to the rise of populist leaders, whether on the right like Trump or Brexit movement, or on the left like Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom. So given all this, I think we increasingly feel like the only path out is these sort of reactionary populist movements that don't really offer an answer. And so we feel the responsibility at this moment to try to put forward an alternative, progressive path that can harness the powers of market and technology, but to try to make a more equal, prosperous, and politically cooperative society. And I hope that you'll open your minds to these radical possibilities given what we're facing. And I'm looking forward to chatting with all of you and with Hal about it.
All right, great. Very interesting talk. And let me raise a few objections here
Yes,
and there
absolutely.
and see, because I know that's your favorite pastime, is responding
Yeah.
to these objections. You know, they say a cynic believes that everything has a price, but an economist knows it's true. So one interesting angle there on that division, this dividing things up and then letting people trade. What do you do about ability? The ability is very tricky because suppose you're a great singer. I love to hear you sing, but it's very tiring for you. You don't want to do it. Can I outbid you and say, yes, I bid him. He wants to have a quiet evening at home, but I've got this money. I'm going to pay him to go out and sing.
So that's a great question. We tackle that in the conclusion of the book. For the main part of the book, we only allow for capital to be allocated in this way. And we think that, at least in our present society, that could address much of the inequality, though not all of the inequality that we face. So we calculate that with our reforms, you could get down below the levels of inequality in the 1970s and significantly better than in Sweden at present. But obviously, there would then be a shift towards inequalities that are driven more by ability and away from those driven by wealth. And those would have to be addressed by future reforms, and we speculate in the direction that you're describing, Hal, but we don't have a proposal that we're happy with actually putting forward on that.
So let me suggest an article. It was something I wrote. It was my thesis, actually, which was on fair division.
Oh, I know that worked very well.
Okay, well, then you know.
Extremely
because
well.
there were a couple ideas there about how you might deal with this issue of either redefining what would be fair when there's differences in ability, or, in fact, going the very radical plan of actually, I could outbid you to sing. And
so I'm actually
do
very
it.
sympathetic to that idea, but for a bunch of practical reasons we talk about in the conclusion, we don't think we have a proposal that actually makes sense. But as a philosophical level, you'll recognize your own writing in what we say about that issue. So.
And it's also interesting because there is a practical example. There were apprenticeships. So what happened in America, I mean, before there was the United States, in fact, back in pre-revolution days, you could bring an immigrant in, and the quid pro quo is they work for you for 7 years, and you would teach them a trade. And so this was viewed as a very successful way to provide education and skills and so on.
I wouldn't say that too loudly, because on the internet, when we certainly weren't advocating indentured servitude, but we just talked about our immigration system, which is not indentured servitude, we got the most crazy reaction from social media. So it's a sensitive subject.
Yes, I agree. And it's also illegal. So.
Yes.
The self-assessed tax, that was kind of fun. I first heard this idea from Dick Zeckhauser, who you know, many years ago about, and he claims that the Greeks used this for assessing antiquities.
Yeah, we talked about it in chapter 1 in some detail,
And in fact, we did something very much like it for the top-level domain names when we had this top-level domain name auction. So Microsoft and Google, for example, both might want .doc as a TLD. And the way it was resolved is you each write down your price, the high bidder gets it and pays the other bidder the price that it bid. So it's a kind of interesting mechanism. It's not, of course, perfect. Any economist that shoots some holes in it, but it seemed to work pretty well in practice. Visas, data as labor. Well, we do that now. We pay labelers of data. We have just donated 9 million images to the Open Image Project. We paid lots of people around the world to label that data with the contents. We did the same thing, 4.5 million YouTube videos, which we had people label, and that goes into the video project. Consumer panels like Nielsen, that's around all the time. So there is a market for getting people to provide data labeling or data of one sort or another. So it's not unreasonably, I mean, it's a pretty big market, really.
Yeah, I think that the problem is that the vast majority of data we collect from people who aren't aware of the productivity roles that it ends up playing, and trying to engage those people more and paying them a bit more for those people who are in context, who can provide additional value. And in fact, Google does a little bit of that with the local hosts and so forth. But I think trying to make people more broadly aware of that and trying to create a structure where they would get direct compensation for improving the quality of the data they provide and be aware of the payments they were getting for all of their data would, in the medium term, create the opportunity for people to build greater human capital, really, and contribute more online.
Well, there is this question of what the payment would look like. If you take Facebook as an example, because I think you mentioned this, Facebook had net earnings of 10 billion, and they claim there are 2 billion users, and that means $5 a year per user. So, and Google has similar numbers, of course. So these work out to pennies per day in terms of the compensation for information that people are providing. And I would argue, I certainly believe for Facebook, I certainly believe for Google and also Facebook, of course, a lot of this data is used to improve the product.
Right.
So people are benefiting from it. It's benefiting as a public good, not as a private good, but they get their private benefit from using better products.
Absolutely. So I think that if we had more targeted direct compensation to people, we would get larger product improvements. I would dispute with you a little bit about some of the numbers. I've done different calculations than that exactly. But yes, at the moment, things are relatively small, I think, by any calculation. But in a future where artificial intelligence really does come up to take the role that investors are pricing into your company and into my company, I think that if we don't find a way to directly compensate people for the data contributions that they're making that are fueling those artificial intelligence, we're going to end up with a lot of what I would call fake unemployment, where people are unemployed, but not because they're not contributing value, just because the value that they are contributing isn't being counted appropriately.
So if you look at the Web Raiders Handbook, I was just looking at this a few days ago. I know several people here have looked at this. We pay thousands of people around the world to answer questions about page quality.
Absolutely.
That is the labeling that then goes into determination of the algorithms and the machine learning that helps make the system work. So there is a direct market in paying people to label. And we could do much more of that, for sure. But the question is, should it be done through the product improvement side of things, or should it be done just as a line item on the budget? We're paying people to rate or evaluate this or label this material in a way that helps us design a superior product.
Yeah, and I think that if more people were aware of the contributions that they're making and were getting compensation for it, you would, I mean, there are absolutely markets, as you're describing, for those labelers. They are a little bit sidelined, and the public image that is portrayed is one in which you don't.
No, you're very right. I mean, nobody knows about this, even though it's easy to check.
Yeah, I think center, putting that more center stage and making more people feel like they're participating in it, I think would change the whole feeling of using the internet in a way that I think would be productive for our social conversation around technology.
Well, it is interesting how many people write reviews for Amazon or for Google or for Yelp, because people are volunteering this information in many cases, and I think you might want to argue that, well, the incremental addition to that free service is worth paying for. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It depends on how much you're getting people to contribute generously of their time in terms of doing these evaluations.
Yeah. Well, so that's a...
Might be.
Yeah.
It's an empirical matter. All right, I'm going to ask one more question, and I apologize, this is slightly technical, but your chart on inverse labor share and the markup, I've actually been working on that problem. This is a paper by Ekut and DeLoker that you're referring to.
Exactly.
And it's a little funny because, remember, markup is the price over marginal cost.
Yeah.
So the markup can go up either by price going up or by marginal cost going down.
Right.
And of course, we think cost going down, gee, that's a good thing. Price going up, that's a bad thing. But of course, by making, by moving around these two things, you can change the level of the ratio of price and marginal cost. So in fact, if you take the formula in that paper for the markup, it's also a formula for marginal cost.
Yeah.
Just rearrange the algebra.
Yeah.
And if you go out and do the calculation, look at the same data or the same sorts of data that they looked at, see costs going way, way
Yeah.
down.
Yeah,
And you
so-
also see, just
Yeah, yeah.
one last point, you also see prices going down. And the
Yeah.
question is, what's happening is the marginal cost is going down even faster than the prices are going down, so the gap is going up.
Yeah. So I mean, marginal costs fell dramatically as well during the post-war period.
Yeah.
And in fact, even more dramatically, because productivity went up more quickly. My view is not everything has been terrible in the last few years. That's not the point. The point is that if we don't have social institutions that reform and restrain market power, that keep up with the progress of technology, we'll fail to realize the potential that we can have, which requires constantly breaking up the sources of rigidity that enter the economy as technology advances. And I think we did that more effectively in the immediate post-war period along certain dimensions, though not all dimensions, than we've managed to do it since then. So my argument is not everything has just gotten worse. Of course not. We wouldn't have had economic growth if that hadn't
Right.
happened. But that we haven't managed to keep up in the innovation of our social institutions with the innovation that we've had on the technological side.
So let me make one other objection to
Yeah.
the Écoute de
Yeah.
Locher
Yeah.
work, because I don't
Yeah.
I mean, I don't dispute anything that
Yeah.
you just said. But if you look at that, the surprising thing from other contributors is the same thing has happened in pretty much every industry. That is, labor share has gone
Right.
down, and pretty much in every country.
Yeah.
So it seems very strange to say, somewhere around 1980, all these different countries and all these different industries became less competitive. It's much more natural to say, well, in the 1980s, we had a technological shock that lowered costs pretty much across all countries and pretty much across all industries. It's called the computer, right? Microcomputer, that's what we've done. And we've seen this technology work its way through with some leaders, that is,
Yeah.
some companies that are doing very well because they've managed to reduce their costs and improve their quality by using this technology. We've seen other companies that haven't done so well because they haven't done this to the same extent. So to me, the technological hit that reduces marginal costs is much more plausible than the concentration hit, which increases prices.
And what I would say is that we had those marginal costs falling before for reasons that were, in fact, more powerful than the computer. Air conditioning, refrigeration, lots of huge technological advances. Except at that time, we had policymakers who were innovating, coming up with things like the welfare state and antitrust policies and labor unions that were keeping up with technology. And in the 1980s, we stopped trying to keep up with the innovations in social policy that were necessary to restrain market power within the technology sector. And that's the reason why we suddenly saw those prices not track as far down with marginal cost as they should have done to maintain both maximum productivity growth and, well, so that's...
Well, but the real debate, I mean, the real question, I think, is this just difficult to learn how to use and adopt this technology?
Yeah.
When electricity came in, we saw the same thing happen. When steam came in, we saw the same thing. It just takes time for this to work its way through the system. So you would expect some companies are going to be more productive than others because they've learned to master the technology. And two of those companies are represented right here, Microsoft and Google. All right. That's my debate, and I'm sure you've got some more ready questions coming. Why don't we start here?
All right. Thank you so much for coming to speak, and thank you for hosting and providing a lively discussion. My name's Steven. So I have one question for you on a subject that you actually haven't really touched on yet, which is the quadratic voting piece.
Yeah.
Simply because I think politics is sort of the iceberg to all of this. It's the underlying set of problems to all of this. And so I'm curious, one, how does that actually work in terms of how does one define the value that each person is given? Is it a static equal value, or can you buy more if you have more income? And two, if you're willing to extend this sort of conversation, just how do you think the globalization of finance has impacted sort of this decoupling of productivity and wages that has happened over the past 30 years, which has greatly contributed to the rise in inequality and many of the problems that you're sort of discussing and thinking about today?
On the first point, it would be not static, it would be dynamic. Over time, people would get voice credits. They would get a flow of voice credits the same way that they get a flow of a social dividend, but it would be equal across all people. There would be no opportunity to use outside financial resources to purchase more, unless in some much more advanced society, when some of these other ideas have been implemented, we have much greater equality, in which case we might consider allowing people, at least at some rate, to purchase more credits. In terms of the globalization of finance, look, I'm not 100% critical of what happened with neoliberalism. I think that there's been a huge amount of growth in the developing world, and to a large extent, that is attributable to the opening up of the international system to allow opportunities to many more people. Unfortunately, while we opened up to other parts of the world, I think our economy domestically within the United States and within other wealthy countries allowed in this greater market power. And to some extent, the external markets were used as a wedge to consolidate the power of capital within national boundaries. And so I think we need to rectify that, because otherwise we're going to get a populist backlash that reacts to the fact that things got better abroad and they didn't get so much better here, and that feels like something that can be cured by xenophobia, which it can't really, but you see how people get that logic. So we need to find a better way to unite the interests of people within the country and around the world. Yeah.
So I have a question. What do you think we can learn from the political failures of the followers of Henry George and so on, insofar as the land value tax, the optimal policy they were proposing at the time, largely ran aground in the Lloyd George budget in the UK. The House of Lords largely said this endangers our interest. Here in California, something like Prop 13, which is largely the exact opposite of an allocative, efficient policy, is impossible to get rid of, seemingly. What do you think we can learn from these failures for putting better policy in the future?
Well, I mean, I think a major problem for Georgism fundamentally was the failure of the Chinese Revolution, because it ended up meaning that, so Sun Yat-sen, who is the founder of the Chinese Revolution, was basically had the same relationship to George that Lenin had to Marx. And the problem was that Lenin was much more ruthless. He managed to, the Bolshevik Revolution managed to survive, and communism spread, and everything that became the leading alternative to capitalism. And so we got stuck in a discourse where everything was about capitalism versus communism. And so I think ultimately, if you can have a comprehensive ideology that helps people rethink things, like Milton Friedman did, he really changed the whole discourse. I think that we can have a path where people understand and believe in that. And I think it came close in England. I think you change a few things, and Georgism would have been very successful in England. But I think that the communist revolution was a big part of what stopped it.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Really interesting point about the concentration of assets in a few very large asset managers, money managers. My question is, where does the political will come from to sort of go after these guys? They control a lot, and I guess this is more broad too. Is like they probably have captured the the Congress and their lobbying drives are going to be incredibly strong versus the very diffuse sense among the populace that it's probably bad to have 4 companies controlling the majority of stock in the United States.
Yeah. So first of all, the most powerful basis of the protection of capital rents is free market rhetoric. I mean, it's not just or even mainly things done in the dark back rooms. Free market rhetoric is something that so many people in this country believe in. And if we can deny to the capitalist monopolists the use of free market rhetoric by saying that true free markets require radical reforms, radical egalitarian reforms, I think we can change the political dynamic around these things significantly. But second of all, it comes from young people. It comes from students. That's how Milton Friedman changed things in the direction that they went in the 1980s. Capitalism and freedom sold terribly among academics, initially, and it was very unpopular in the press, but students loved it. And he had a coherent view, and it applied to many things, and he really changed the whole political discourse in the country. So I do believe that in the medium term, ideas clearly exposited that try to directly connect to the public can have a huge effect on world history.
Hi.
Yeah.
Oh, I have a question. I'm a newbie to economic and politics, and recently I watched Ray Dalio's How Economy Works in 30 Minutes.
Yeah.
So he talks about borrowing and lending, and he say because of that we have credit, and it's new human nature that we tend to borrow from the future, and which lead to some economic crisis because it's cycles. So I'm just wondering, in your ideal market, will there be economic crisis? And if there are, will there be difference in how we address the economic crisis?
So I think that that's a great question. I can't say that I confidently predict that there wouldn't be crises in the world that I'm describing, but I think that they would probably be less severe. And the reason is precisely what you just said, which is that debt and the rigidities associated with private property as well are a leading cause of what happens during economic crises. And in this world, there would be far, far less debt, because it would be much less important to take on debt to own assets, because the value of all assets would be greatly reduced. People would be effectively closer to renting assets, and therefore many of the sources of instability that come from debt finance would be much less severe. Go ahead.
Hey, my question is, it seems to me like perhaps some products are not naturally amenable to constant liquid exchange, like housing, for example. I might want to live in a particular place for decades at a time, and if I'm outbid on it and I don't want to leave, then getting me to do so requires violence. Or, for example, physical infrastructure like trains. It seems like there would be an enormous cost if the administration of this infrastructure were constantly changing hands. So, okay, I mean, I think that gives you enough to reply to.
So, obviously, you could maintain stability in this world by charging a higher price so that it's harder for someone to take something from you. Now, in our present world as well, stability is costly. Wealthy people, they live in safe areas that aren't hit by natural disasters. They own their houses outright. They usually don't rent, et cetera, so they enjoy much greater stability. The poor, they rent or they are underwater often with their homes, either figuratively or literally sometimes, living in very dangerous areas. And so in this society, just like in our present society, stability is costly. But the difference in this society is that everyone would have an equal or a far closer to equal basis to pay for that stability as they desired it than in our present society, because you would tax the wealthy's demand for stability at the cost of the opportunity of the less well-off, whereas in our present society, they can enjoy that stability at no cost to themselves, or at much more limited cost to themselves.
Hi, it's me again. I have lots of questions. So with regard to both the self-assessed tax and the quadratic voting, I'm sure the answers would be slightly different, but the question and problem that I'm posing, I think, are quite the same, which is how would you limit collusion and sort of gaming of such a system in which individuals could, on the self-assessed tax side, more or less set a price that is above market that others could buy, but low enough to maintain a lower tax? And then on the political side, this happens in our elections already, people running sort of spoiler candidates in primaries or having some sort of spoiler referendum to try and split a vote. How would you imagine that could be protected against, particularly when if I were to put more of my energy in one issue, I would necessarily be putting less energy and voice into another?
So it's more than I have time for to go into detail about each one of the points in terms of collusion and so forth, but that's an absolutely central thing to the book. I definitely encourage you to read the book. But the short version is all those sorts of problems exist in our present system. They are dramatically reduced, if not eliminated, in the system that I'm describing. So I'll just give you one example. So right now, there's the problem when you have an election of a spoiler candidate running and possibly messing up the main two candidates. But maybe even worse, there's the fact that you can end up with two candidates that everyone despises, but everyone votes for one candidate to block the other candidate. That's, I think, an even worse problem than the spoiler. In this system, you can show that that's not mathematically possible. Because what happens is that because of the quadratic nature of the cost, if you really hate Hillary Clinton, you'll vote at least as much against Hillary as you'll vote in favor of Trump, and vice versa. And so that pushes two candidates that everyone hates down to 0 votes. And so then that leads other candidates to rise up, so you don't end up with these perverse strategic things where the two leading candidates get reinforced just to beat the other one.
Wait, sorry, could you repeat that?
So if you have two candidates, both of whom are really hated by the other side, but no one really likes them, then what happens is that those candidates get negative votes on them, so they go down to like 0 net votes. And so anyone else who's like not despised ends up becoming a leading candidate. And so you can prove that that will lead to it never being the case that you just get a perverse thing of two people that are really disliked winning just to beat the other one. Here you were waiting.
Yeah, thank you so much. How do you think blockchain technology relates to the ideas you have in your book or the research you've done?
So that's a wonderful question. Vitalik Buterin, who's the founder of Ethereum, just wrote a wonderful long post about that, which I would definitely recommend to you. And he and I are writing something together that should come out this week about the relationship. But very briefly, what I would say is the exact technological relationship is complex and it will evolve. But philosophically, I think they're very closely connected. In particular, both are trying to figure out monetary, market-based, distributed, decentralized systems for ensuring through rules of the game rather than through discretionary authority that we have a more egalitarian distribution of economic power. I think a major weakness in blockchain thus far has been that it's been focused primarily on the cryptographic protocols rather than on the substantive rules implemented by those cryptographic protocols. And as a result, some of the rules have ended up giving power, in fact, to oligarchic groups, say in China, that end up controlling them. So they don't really achieve the goals that they're aiming at. What they need is a substantive set of rules to be implemented by those cryptographic protocols so that they actually instantiate their goals. And that's precisely what Buterin tries to argue in this piece and that we're arguing together. So I think that there's a tight unity of purpose between these, though the actual technological connection is something that's going to need to develop in the coming years or months even. So I'm actually speaking at the main Ethereum conference on Saturday about exactly this stuff. So yeah, go ahead.
Just going back to the previous question,
Yeah.
To be honest, I think trying to apply any rigorous mathematical proof to the political system, especially the American political system, is doomed to failure. But
Yeah.
I think one question I would have in terms of implementation, you mentioned that like this quadratic voting system seems like extremely radical.
Yeah.
What are the sort of baby steps that you mentioned
Yeah.
in terms of actually trying to implement this, especially in the U.S.?
Absolutely. So let me see if we don't have the computer going, but I can show you afterwards. We have a nice user interface that even for people who haven't completed high school makes it very intuitive to do quadratic voting, and we've been using that to do polling. And we've gotten some very interesting results where we're able to elicit intensity of preference much more reliably than you can get from existing methods. That's a good place to start, but the next place that we really want to go is ratings. Say of ride-sharing drivers or products online, where you have this problem of people often going to extremes and a lot of sort of trolling type behavior. And if you made something costly and made there be real trade-offs for people to budget to upvote or downvote things, I think you could get much more reliable and useful feedback in a variety of circumstances.
Yeah, but in terms of actually putting into place in American elections.
Well,
like
my
how
view
would
is that once you start using it in some of these commercial domains, you gradually expand them outwards. As people get more used to it in different domains, there will be greater willingness to experiment in other domains. Blockchain is another place where I think that it's quite likely that this will be used in some reasonably near term. And I think people will get used to the technology. Like, it's sort of like, e-government happened to a large extent because of all the advances that were made in the private sector, and then those were imported into the public sector. So I expect something similar would happen with this.
We'll take one more question. Did you had the mic? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go.
Thank you for sharing your ideas again. I look forward to reading the book. You said that the primary urgency of what you propose is because there is an impending doom almost if we don't do something about the current status quo.
Yeah.
But do you see this marketopia being implemented without massive upheaval? Because I think what you're trying to suggest is that we need to save our society almost.
Yeah.
But from the way I see it, it seems like we almost need to almost throw away society in order to implement this without like the oligarchs, without the current special interests basically taking control of this or skewing it in a way that basically either ruins it or prevents it from ever seeing the light of day.
I believe that revolutions are not always, but almost always, more destructive than they are productive. And on the other hand, I do believe in the power of democracy and ideas if widely disseminated, thoughtfully engaged with, and widely understood. I think public understanding is the greatest accountability against special interest capture. So I put my faith in that ultimately, and I hope that young people, including some people in this room, will build on the transmission of different aspects of these ideas so that we can keep the broad public engaged and keep the political process accountable to that. I think you saw with what happened in the last year or two how much desire there is for change, and if that's channeled in a direction that's productive rather than destructive, I think that we have an opportunity to build a much better society, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I believe did, rather than just having a violent upheaval.
Okay, thank you very much, Glenn.
Yeah.